Good morning. We are reading The Wheel on the School by Maynard de Jong, pictures by Maurice Sendak. We are on chapter 15, Storks in the Sea. In the dinghy, no one talked. The two men in yellow had to strain too hard at the oars for talk. The heavy work, the wash, and the unevenness of the fall and rise of the waves made it impossible for the inexperienced teacher to dip his oars in cleanly and pull at just the right time. He was doing his best, using every fiber of his untrained muscles. You couldn't ask more of the man. Giannis bent his powerful body a little harder to the task of forcing the boat ahead. Now and then, dipping in among the troughs and rising on the crest of a wave, Lena in the stern could see Pierre's head rise above the rowing men. Pierre was keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the tower. Always when Pierre's face bobbed up again, he was looking at the tower, never at the sea and the waves. His face was greenish, strained, but his lips were pale. Pierre was fighting seasickness. Even when riding the crest of a long wave, Lena could nowhere catch sight of the storks or the sandbar. The sea was an endlessly tossing mass. The sky was dark and somber. Sometimes the tip of the lighthouse was penciled white against the sky. Then it sank into the sea again. Only Giannis would know the distance to and the exact location of the sandbank. But Giannis was grimly silent. Suddenly, he took his eyes off the two rowers ahead of him and flashed a look back at the tower and the clock. He silently rowed on for a few minutes. "Teacher," he said impatiently, "drop back, crawl over to Lena, and rest a while." Without a word, Yella slid into the center of the seat the moment the teacher moved. He grabbed the teacher's oar. Giannis began grunting and counting out a new rhythm he was setting to push the boat ahead harder. Yella fell into the rhythm at once. His powerful young back moved naturally in unison with the broad back of Giannis. The four oars dipped and flashed together. "You can see he's the son of a fisherman," the exhausted teacher said to Lena. Lena nodded. Her eyes searched the sea in the hope of finding something white among the gray waves. Again Giannis glanced back at the tower. 20 minutes, he muttered. "In another 20 minutes the flood tide starts, and then we won't be going anywhere but back to the dike, and those storks will go under. Kid, if you ever rowed, row now." "Can we make it in 20 minutes in this sea?" the teacher asked. "I'm setting a course that'll get us behind the sandbanks," Giannis said. "Once they're ahead of us, they'll break the force of the waves. It won't be so roily then, and we should make it." When Lena looked back again, she had made herself wait until she had seen Pierre's head rise up 12 times. The face of the clock was blurry. They were moving. If you did it that way, you could see the progress. The boat wasn't just rising and falling and dancing. Giannis and Yella were really pulling the boat ahead. Oh, they were strong. Pierre kept his eyes away from the greenish waves in the water. He still looked only at the tower. The sweat was rolling down his sick face. But he stubbornly wasn't letting the seasickness get the best of him. "Here we are," Giannis said at last, although it was noticeable to no one else. "Now, Yella, 10 more good strokes, and we're in the lee of the banks. Come on, boy." At the end of the 10 strokes, they all felt it, sensed it, although they could not really see it. But the great force of the waves seemed to be broken here. It was easy to tell that the boat forged ahead. Without a word to anyone, the teacher crawled back to his seat at the oar. As the teacher started to row, there was a sudden rush and swirl of water. A swelling came to the whole sea. They rose. The whole sea rose. The ground swell of the tide had come. This was the beginning of the flood tide. "The tide!" Pierre yelled. They were the first words he had spoken. "Now row!" Giannis said fiercely. "Row like crazy! Chop it ahead!" In a matter of seconds, the high back of a sandbar rose out of the water before them. Pierre twisted around and stood up. Clinging with one hand to the side of the boat, he stretched as high as he dared to look over the sandbar for the storks. Lena expected Giannis to yell at him to sit down. But instead, Giannis told Pierre, "That's right, stand ready. Jump and run up that bank with the anchor the moment you think you can make it. Then go for the storks." Pierre turned and stared at Giannis in open-mouthed unbelief. "That's right," Giannis yelled. "That's sand solid. I've been on it many a time. The real tide is just rolling in past the lighthouse right now. You've got time. The boat's bow shot up the bank and grounded in the sand. Pierre jumped and landed hard with the heavy anchor. He held the anchor up against his chest and carried it part way up the bank where he dropped it. He looked to Giannis for further instructions and assurance. You've got 3 minutes, by my reckoning. In 3 minutes, the flood tide will be rolling over this bank. Get going, Giannis said. Pierre looked scared, but he turned and scrambled up the bank. For a moment, he stood on the top of the ridge. They're here! They're here, he screamed. They're alive, but they're up to their necks in water. Grab them, Giannis called hoarsely. Grab them by their necks and drag them here. They won't fight. They're done in. Quick now. Quick, or you'll all three drown. With a last scared look at the boat, Pierre disappeared. It was a tense, awful wait. The empty sand rose before them. Pierre had vanished as if he had sunk into the sea. Hidden from sight by the high ridge of sand, but thunderous in their ears, the wall of flood tide came rolling toward them in one great roar. It's coming, Giannis said. He dug his oar into the sand and shoved the stern of the boat around so the boat would be lying broadside to the bank when Pierre should come. Drag that anchor in. I'll hold the boat with the oar, he called to Yella. Just get the anchor. Don't you go over the ridge. That kid'll be lucky if he has time to make one jump for the boat. What's keeping him? Then from behind the ridge they heard a shout. Giannis! Giannis, the tide! Giannis! Giannis, forgetting himself, strained at the ropes as if to rise and run to Pierre. At that moment, Pierre's head appeared over the ridge. He came running wildly ahead of the roaring wall of water that seemed to thunder right behind him. He came plunging down the bank, his eyes horrified and huge. He was dragging 2 storks by their necks. Their wings flapped feebly. Jump, kid, jump! Pierre jumped. Lena caught one of the storks as it swung toward her. Pierre crumpled into the bottom of the boat at her feet, still clutching the other stork. He lay there sobbing. They fought me. They wouldn't come, and they were so heavy and sunk in the sand, he said over and over. Then he was suddenly angry. Giannis, it wasn't solid. I sank in it too when the water came. Giannis was too busy to answer. He ripped his oar out of the sand and pushed the boat free. The flood tide rushed over the sandbar like a hissing, seething waterfall. But the boat was free. Behind the bank, the flood tide seized it and the boat shot ahead. Swiftly, the boat was carried forward on the tide. I guess I didn't figure with the storm, Giannis told Pierre. Those 5 days of storm must have left all kinds of sticky sea silt on that sand. But you made it, didn't you? Lena sat with the stork in her lap. Pierre crouched at her feet, and a last sob forced its way out of him. He breathed deeply. He pulled himself up on the seat next to Lena and held the other stork in his lap. He and Lena sat very still. They sat looking at the great white birds, half dead, half drowned. Only a dim flicker in the eyes showed they were still alive. Pierre softly stroked the long neck of his stork. Lena hugged her stork to her as if to warm it. It was unbelievable. Storks in their laps. Great, strange birds that flew over oceans and seas and continents were lying here in their laps. Pierre and Lena looked at each other, an awed, astounded look. Then they looked at the storks again, trying to believe it. They were unaware that the boat, riding rapidly on the sweep of the tide, was nearing the dike in the tower. Hey, hold their necks, Giannis suddenly warned. They're still wild even if they are pretty meek now. But with those bills, they could knock holes in you 2 kids. Lena looked up alarmed. Pierre didn't listen, but went on stroking the long, stretched-out neck of the white bird for which he had almost given his life. It couldn't be believed. We've got 2 storks, he mumbled queerly to Lena, as if only now was the fact beginning to dawn on him. Suddenly, Dirk, Alka, and Ailka were yelling at them from the dike. Pierre and Lena looked up, startled. They were back. Here was the dike. And there stood not only Dirk, Ailka, and Alka, but all the women and all the little children with Dauva. Even Grandmother Sybil stood there. All of Shora was on the dike.